material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Hello, Ashley.
Hi there. Good morning.
Good morning or good evening where you are. I'm glad to get to talk to you again, and I want to let people know that it looks like there's at least one person watching, that you're going to be regularly live streaming on our YouTube channel starting sometime in the next month or so, right?
Yes.
I wanted to put you on the spot and make you say that in public. So, but also we're going to be talking about the cultural framing in our politics and in our community work, and what the impact of that has been in Canada on First Nation people. But before we do that, Ashley, I'm sorry to spring this on you, but in the United States, there was a caucus, I think, or a fracas or some sort of circus in Iowa. It's part of what's been known in the past as a presidential election. We may not be having them in the future. We're not sure what's going on, but a bunch of people got in gymnasiums and high school cafeterias and churches, and they ran around with signs saying that they liked this or that candidate. And at the end of the night, the officials there, I guess, took all the results and flushed them in the toilet or set them on fire. We're not sure. There was an app involved. Pete Buttigieg seemed very happy with the results. And I was livid by the end of the night. So before we even get to any of the questions, I want to ask you this, or maybe not ask you this, but put this forward as a talking point for us this morning or this evening where you are. What do we do when we realize our institutions are failing us? When it really comes home that investing hope in the Democratic Party or the establishment parties is a dead end, and you need to do something else. And I don't expect you to have any answers. I just wanted to put that out there rhetorically, but I'll let you introduce yourself and say something in response.
Right. So my name is Ashley Frawley. I'm a senior lecturer in sociology and social policy. If you don't know me already, at Swansea University. So I'm in the UK. So I read this news this morning as well. What do we do when our institutions fail us? Well, on the one hand, we should kind of expect that our institutions can only go so far within a capitalist system, to offer, fundamental change. Of course, within those institutions, however, we can do a lot, and we can force capitalism to be progressive. We have to. Mm-hmm. And that's really why democracy is so important, and why it's not a good idea to kind of drop out of the system. Although it makes sense, you can, for up until very recently, until 4 years ago, it was the thing that people were talking about was apathy, that people had become really apathetic. And why were people apathetic? Because politics had just become a big PR campaign, and kind of people were aware of that, and they knew. And in some sense, people are still trying to hold on desperately to that bygone age. And there's this desperate attempt to hold back the tide of change. But in terms of concretely, what do we do? All that we really have is one, for radical politics, it's banding together. It's particularly as workers, is fighting for workers' rights and better pay and better conditions and job security and all of that stuff. And in terms of party politics, well, it's trying to, I don't know. I think it's trying to push past this tendency that's developed for, two parties. That's the issue that we have in the UK as well. They're just basically two big parties, one of which is destroyed for, I think, the next decade. The Labour Party is just in absolute disarray, which is really a shame because now there's no representation.
I don't remember the author of this book or when it was written, but there was a book written years and years ago about paranoia and American politics, saying that paranoia kind of defines American politics in particular, So this morning, I'm fighting that American tendency to be very paranoid about the Iowa caucus, and to just to put some of the little factoids out there that really they don't connect up to anything right now. I don't know anything, but here's some of the things I've heard. Pete Buttigieg helped fund the people who designed the app for Iowa, and the name of the company that designed the app that went wrong in Iowa is called Shadow Incorporated. And I have this feeling of like last night when the results failed to come in, I posted on Facebook, the same people who killed Jeffrey Epstein have killed this caucus. But I just feel as though I feel this very strong temptation to start thinking along the lines of, the DNC cabal and a conspiracy to suppress the Sanders vote and to make sure socialism can arrive through the electoral process. But it's important not to get kind of caught up in an emotional response, isn't it? And I'm just asking you to talk me off the ledge here, Ashley. So talk me off the ledge.
I need to be talked off the ledge myself. That was my first thought. I was like, oh, something shady's going on here.
Yeah, that's right.
My first reaction, though, to anything is always wrong. So I always have to, my first reaction, and it always takes me a little bit of time to think and decide really what's going on. No, I think it's actually very strange how slow institutions have been to catch up with technology. So I do think it's just literally they could not cope with the new paper trail that they had created. It's just poor planning, which just looks terrible, especially right now. Everything's in disarray and Trump is laughing.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, it is really, really tempting to be conspiratorial, but I don't think so.
Yeah. Okay. So if it's just a technical problem, then it isn't that big a deal. The DNC will fix this eventually. We'll get some sort of results, and there's always New Hampshire. If the Epstein's killers are behind killing this app, then we have a deeper problem of trying to overcome corruption within the electoral process. So I guess it's better but there's not anything I can think of doing for that. So I guess the only way to step forward is to try to continue to organize, continue to think about what needs to be overcome. In terms of how to overcome capitalism and how to be to arrive towards something like socialism, and drink lots of coffee. So that's what I'll be doing. But
keep kind of asking. Yeah, sorry.
No, you go ahead. I was just gonna keep babbling.
Oh no, I was just gonna say. So was I. Just basically that we need to keep thinking and keep asking where capitalism is taking us as well, and to be on the side of progress. And that's really where the democratic process comes in, is to ensure that we kind of vote against those people who are trying to drag us back. I always say this, capitalism has a progressive side and it also has a regressive side, and these two sides are sort of battling it out. And we kind of have to sit on that side of history that's going forward. And just try our best to ensure that the people who take power are the people who are best placed to put those, systems in place that we need. And part of that, and part of the reason why, Sanders was interesting, is interesting. Oh, no, not past.
They killed him.
Yeah, it is interesting as a candidate is because, he's put forward strong statements about trade unions. And I really think the dissolution of trade unions has been a serious blow, There's very, very little you can do when your organizing is all outside the workplace and individualized. So I don't want to be romantic, but I do think that, people coming together as workers is really, really important. And that is where we force capitalism to be progressive.
All right. Well, listen, we will now kind of step away from the Iowa caucus, and I feel like it's the only psychologically healthy thing for me to do if I want to be happy. But that's a little inside joke. But what we'll talk about instead is how our politics and our thinking about social problems has become cultural, moved towards a cultural. But before we get there, I just want to say to people who might be watching, there's a few people watching. On Thursday, I'm planning on doing a live stream with C. Derek Varn about, I guess, parapolitics in Iowa and the Democratic Party race, and I expect to be told what to think, and so people might want to tune in for that on Thursday. But so we're not done with this topic, but let's talk about step back, talk about some more general trends. You have been working on the problem of cultural framing in not just politics but in social issues, and so I want to give you an opportunity to kind of frame that question of how to understand social problems in cultural terms and what the limits are for that. So do you want to tell me what you think the approach has been, or how we've come to think of our social problems in cultural terms, just to begin with, or what that means?
Yeah, so we started to think about social problems as individual problems, as cultural problems. I think partially because we've lost any vocabulary for talking about social issues in a material way. And so everything becomes caused by cultural forms, which easily then tends into, well, people are brainwashed by consumerism and marketing and so on. Not me, though. Not me. I can stand up to it. But those people out there, which then kind of leads down a very dangerous and anti-democratic and anti-human kind of path. Whereas what you really want to do in order to understand social problems is the much more different. It's easy to say, well, the reason why this happens is because people are stupid. But the hard question is, why does it appear logical at the individual level to do things that at the aggregate level are quite illogical, or appear to be illogical, or produce illogical effects? And so that's what I think a Marxist analysis does, is that, and why I like Marx so much is the way that he looks at things. He doesn't start from people making mistakes or individuals being stupid, as much as people like to kind of paint Marx as this person who's like this anti-consumerist and so on. And he looks at how logical actions at the individual level build up to something that is quite illogical, and the way that people will try to, you put a regulation in place, and people will try to get around the regulation, not because they're assholes, but because there's some kind of logic that's pushing people to do that. And the question is, what is that logic? And so that's why I much prefer a materialist analysis of social problems as opposed to an individualized one, a cultural one, or a psychological one.
Yeah. Now, you recently gave a talk about how our cultural or psychological framing for social problems influences or impacts First Nations and communities that are First Nation communities and these communities are facing real material difficulties. How did do you know how the cultural framing came to be when it in terms of addressing the social ills that First Nation people in Canada are facing? And can you give me an example of that kind of approach to solving social problems?
Yeah, so I guess if you're not kind of familiar with the sort of discourses about First Nations people and why there are certain problems, then you might need a bit of an explanation of that. But basically, there's been this tendency. So I just submitted a paper, which is why I'm a little bit sleep deprived. So I did this sort of discursive analysis of documents talking about social problems facing Indigenous people in Canada. And what I noticed was that in the causal stories about why there are social problems, why there are huge inequalities between First Nations, between Indigenous people and the rest of Canada, so causal story is a term that I've borrowed from Stone, 1989. And referencing while I'm talking, which basically says that social problems usually have this story that you tell about what causes them. And there's an empirical side and a moral side. So the empirical side is what is the mechanism of harm? So how can we understand what exactly is causing the harm? And then the moral side assigns blame. So the mechanism of harm is always situated in the past, in the history of colonialism, and the blame is then explicitly placed on the colonial past. So they say it is due to residential schools, colonial policy, assimilation, and so on and so forth, that we've disrupted cultural transmission between generations amongst Indigenous people. So because of colonialism, that normal transfer of cultural identity and meaning and language and so on has been disrupted. Now that's undoubtedly true to a certain extent, but that's not necessarily true for everyone. And to say that Indigenous people now lack culture has come to sound very, very progressive, except that this is a rehashing of a very old idea that's not just used to talk about Indigenous people, but has also been used to talk about poor people in other countries. The reason why they're poor is because they lack culture. And now this has been, it's been rehabilitated to a certain extent, and there are progressive forms of this argument. Nonetheless, when it comes to Indigenous people, the basic story goes that it's essentially, so the explicit blame is the government, past colonial government, and the implicit blame is parents now. Because they've been traumatized by residential schools, they've been traumatized by their own parents, we now have cycles of social problems. And what we've essentially done is, Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, we've got on the bottom material security and then, self-actualization at the top. We basically flip that around. And we're saying now, in order to solve these social problems, poverty and so on, you need to go into parenting and go into these cultures and inculcate cultural values and how to be a parent. And then somehow, some way, we will reach material security. But from my perspective, obviously, I think they've got that backward. And there's no evidence. In fact, there's a growing history of failure of all of these attempts to inculcate self-esteem and well-being and mental health promotion, and how they ultimately failed to make good on their promises to solve serious social problems, because those problems are ultimately material. And then you wind up blaming parents. And is it any surprise then that they're taking children away from Indigenous parents in huge numbers? Because the ultimate source of blame for ongoing social problems is parents, even if they're very apologetic about it and place the explicit blame on the government. The implicit blame is Indigenous parents. You are not passing on. You've lost your ability to parent. They say this all the time, because you didn't learn how to be mothers yourselves. You aren't able to mother your children. And I've heard this so many times. My aunt has even said it to me. We never learned to be mothers, Ashley. I find that very insulting. My grandmother didn't go to residential school.
As someone who's parented 4 kids, no one ever said to me, my father or grandfather never said, "Oh, we never learned to be fathers." That's never was said. No one ever asked me if I thought I knew how to be a father. It was sort of assumed that as long as I stayed out of the way, everything would be fine, which has largely turned out to be true. But the other thing about that, beyond the gendered side of that, is obviously the First Nation cultural side of that. But when people who are not, individuals within family or people who are working on this in an atomized way, but people who are maybe social workers, think about the problems of Indigenous people in Canada, do they think about the economic isolation of these communities, or the limitations based on wealth distribution, or because there's two sides. As a not deeply educated person about Indigenous people, the way I think about the position of Indigenous people is that, like everyone else in a way, but in a very, violent way, these are people who've been lifted out of their old ways of life and placed into modernity. And when you're talking about their culture, you're talking about practices that had an economic value in an old way, in a previous form of life, and now the goal would be for indigenous people to adapt to and maybe transcend the terms of modernity. So that means, that will have to mean an abandonment of what is thought of as, traditional indigenous culture, and an embrace of some new kind of indigenous culture. And that we all kind of all face that prospect, and we're not doing it particularly well. But it's not like if you're a Christian, that your Christianity serves the same function as it did, 300 years ago. You're not in a Christian community the way you were. So is there a desire to try to create like a space where the old culture can really have deep material roots? Is that what people are thinking, or are they thinking about integration? How does this idea that they need to return to the culture impact, the aims of a material advancement, or something like indigenous capitalism, or entrepreneurship, or something like that?
Well, actually, interesting. There are some reserves that have gone the sort of capitalist route, and they're the ones I think that have done the best. So there's a reserve in BC that produces wines, and they've used a lot of their land for vineyards, and they do a lot of tourism, and they still have about a 20% unemployment rate. But that is like way better than other reserves. And they don't have a lot of the same social problems. Surprise, surprise. But I think what's happened is that material development has been conceived of as colonialism, right? And so there is this uncertainty about how to solve material problems because that is perceived as colonization. So there is this humongous sort of romanticism. When I was looking through these documents, there was this extreme romanticization of indigenous culture, and this idea that if the sort of government could intervene and inculcate that culture again, then these problems would disappear. But what the interventions were is basically what I call localized mainstream parenting discourse, which basically is obviously a portmanteau of globalization and localization, right? So this idea of parenting now has just gone all over the world, which basically says most social problems can ultimately be understood by how parents raise their children. And therefore, most social problems can be solved by going in and changing the way that parents relate to their children. And you just see more and more blame placed on parents for most social issues, and the minutiae of everything that a parent does becomes pregnant with meaning. So you don't just play with your baby because you want to and it's a nice thing to do. You're instructed to play with your baby because the eye contact helps her brain to, and you have to say this many words to the baby every day or else she's not going to develop language. It's like, this idea that, don't hit them over the head with a frying pan, don't lock them in a closet, but probably they'll be all right, with most well-meaning people. I mean, like throughout human history, we've kind of managed to figure it out. Instead, it's become this, what Sharon Hayes calls an expert-driven, emotionally intensive, financially expensive business of intensively raising children, or intensive parenting. And now this has become
I just want to say that, I wish you'd been there when my kids were younger, because I could have noted those things down. Don't hit them with the frying pan. That's what you're saying? Okay.
Don't hit them with the frying pan. Don't lock them up.
All right. I'm sorry, kids. I didn't know. Okay. Keep going.
Don't joke about that. I didn't stalked by some really crazy people.
Oh yeah. Okay. I know. My kids are all. My youngest is 15, so I'm sort of, no one's gonna really be that concerned about no one's going to stick Child Protective Services on me at this point, because my older kids are out of the house and my youngest is 15, and if they met him, they'd want to hit him on the head with a frying pan. So I'm free and clear.
Problem is you didn't hit him enough with the frying pan. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, right.
So basically, there's this idea that everything that you do ultimately determines what the person becomes, and therefore whether or not they are a social problem, or they become problematic, they get involved in crime, and so on. And now this has just gone all over the world and has become really, really influential in policy everywhere. And so the idea is that by, I always explain it like a game of musical chairs. I don't know if I've ever sort of given you this example before, but it's like, our capitalist societies are a bit like this, game of musical chairs where, we're dancing and the music stops, somebody gets left out. And we go, oh, why did you get left out? And the person says, well, I tripped and fell. And you go, okay, we'll play the game again. This time, don't trip and fall. We'll make sure you don't trip and fall. Okay, so we play the game again. Music stops. Someone gets left out. Why did you get left out? Oh, well, I wasn't quite so fast. All right, let's play the game again. This time we're going to give you training to ensure, we're going to give everybody training to ensure that they all run very fast. Okay, right. At the end of the day, someone gets left out. Jeez, why'd you get left out? I don't know.
My mother didn't parent me right.
And then so we go and we make everybody wonderful parents, but it's not enough. You got to be intensive. And then it's like, let's do a brain scan. And sure enough, there might be, individual differences that ultimately explain why that person got left out this time. But at the end of the day, someone was going to get left out. But instead, we've become so intensively focused on individuals and individual difference and what your parents were like and what your parents did. And this then becomes an impossible burden. And so now you're supposed to parent very, very intensively. And if you don't parent intensively, then you are to blame. So you see people all the time, like, back in the day, I'm going to be romantic about my childhood, but I spent most of my childhood literally in a forest with other children. And it was like Lord of the Flies. And like, I remember like we were playing jump rope on ice, like on a frozen lake.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
You can guess how that went. We're like, oh shoot, she fell through the ice. We like got to walk her home, and clothes were freezing on her. Like no parents around whatsoever. And now it's this idea, like if you see parents at the park with their kids, they're up on the equipment playing with their kids. And if you see a parent like on their phone while the kids are playing, you're like, that parent, So there's this idea that you're supposed to be spending all this intensive time with children. Now, throughout, if you switch over from this obsession with developmental psychology over to anthropology, you see that it's actually quite rare in the anthropological record to be spending that much time for adults, to be spending that much one-to-one time with children. In fact, mothers playing with children is pretty rare, which kind of makes sense, right? Like throughout history and in cultures where you have lots of children, the parents will raise the first ones themselves, but the second ones will be raised by the other children. And there'll be lots of people. And you don't want your child to see you as a playmate because you don't have the time to be doing that. You're either pregnant or breastfeeding another child.
You have to enforce some authority. I found that it's very difficult to go from pretending to be a wizard, to telling the kids it's time to go, pack up. I'm in charge here. It is difficult to make that transition.
You can't. It's very, very hard. It's very, very hard to parent if you have no authority. And actually, this idea of parental authority is really looked down on, is really seen as quite dangerous. And it's this idea that we should have like equality, that children should be equals and it should all be a democracy, forgetting the fact that actually children don't have fully developed reason, which is why they don't have all the freedoms that we allow adults, right?
You have to use that back to your advantage, that they don't have fully developed reason or a sense of time. You can't just, that only lasts for a little while, that they're going to fall for your tricks.
But what I was the point that I was making, though, is that basically what the government or what these interventions were doing is they were presenting that intensive parenting culture, which has become really influential in policy and is seen as a solution to social problems. They were localizing that advice and basically presenting it as though it was a return to indigenous culture. So
that is colonization right there. Forcing white neurosis on indigenous people, making us that's freaking colonization. So anyway, but when did this start to happen, that every First Nation person, First Nation mother had to be a Portlander hippie parent?
Well, they don't expect that, but they do see indigenous mothers as to blame for sure, and all indigenous mothers, not just people with serious problems, but everybody. And that's what winds up happening is you have increased surveillance, right? And if you have increased surveillance, you have more of a risk of having your children removed. And so that's one of the reasons why we have a huge number of Indigenous children being removed.
And are mothers really buying into this idea that that they're not equipped to deal with their kids, and that they themselves are damaged, and that they are at risk of damaging their kids, and really
it's not research that I've done. So I keep cutting off because I have to go, unfortunately.
Okay.
But it's not research that I've done, but Krista Maxwell has done some really awesome research where she's actually talked to Indigenous women about this, and they will say things like, our parents are damaged and we're damaged and our children will be damaged, and it will go on and on.
Well, I know you have to go. Can I have 5 more minutes maybe with you? 5?
Let's say 2 minutes. 2 minutes.
2 minutes. All right. Well, then listen. We'll have to do this another stream in the future. This is partially my fault that I got on the stream late because I was getting up late because I started drinking scotch after a certain point last night with the Iowa caucus. But I wanted to flash this question on the screen. Have Doug, and by the way, there's an O in my name. 1916 Rev. Have Doug or Ashley written a book? So yes, you've written a book. What's the book that you wrote? People can
so
go find.
My first book was Semiotics of Happiness, Rhetorical Beginnings of a Public Problem, which looks at the construction of happiness as a social problem, how it sounds very progressive, but is actually quite conservative, and I think possibly an attempt to make sense of stagnation within capitalism and present that as a wonderful return to the harmonious steady state where we're all happy, and instead of horrific crisis, which is actually the case. So that's one argument that I put forward in that book. And my second book is Significant Emotions, Rhetoric and Social Problems in a Vulnerable Age. I always forget the subtitle. And that my publisher is desperately trying to get me to submit. I still haven't submitted it. But
and you're going to be writing a book for Zero Books. You're going to be writing a book for Zero Books after that one.
My husband has made me promise no more books. My poor husband, my long-suffering husband, he has to deal with all my all-nighters. But yes, I am looking to write a book for Zero as well.
You know he's your oppressor.
Just read the manuscripts, but write one.
Do not give in to the patriarchy, okay? And don't listen to your husband. Write a book for Zero Books. And okay, so yeah, and I have written a book as well. This is mine, Batch Revolution. It's my third novel, so that's what everyone should go and grab who's listening to us right now. And we're both working at Zero Books, and we're both going to write. I'm going to probably try to write a book for Zero Books. I'm thinking I might try a critique of the new socialist program as a title for a future book based on Marx's critique of the Gotha program as applied. So the lessons learned there, things you can glean from the history of social democracy, and then apply that to like Nathan Robinson's book and the Chapo people's book, and just, you know, I want to make enemies out of everyone. So
okay. I gotta go.
Okay.
All right.
Great talking to you guys.
You too. Bye.